yeah, my problem is that I got into classic video game collecting like when I don't know. I learned how to use eBay when I was in like I want to say I was in like middle school or something. It was like I was super young, and I can remember that first time I bought a bunch of like Sega Genesis stuff, and then it came in, and I mean it was just really cool, and you know you'd always have lots because people would always sell like their whole collection because nobody used it anymore, nobody cared. So you try to find like a few lots that sort of had different classic hard to find games and whatnot. I think I got to the point where I had like about 100 or so Sega Genesis games. I mean, like I love Toe Jam and Earl.
Oh God, yeah, Toe Jam.
And then I actually like the sequel to that one better than I like the original. The sequel was just like a side scroller, whereas the original was kind of that pseudo 3D, which was not particularly good at what it did, but it had style, and the second one had style, and it was like. The idea was that Toe Jam and Earl had sailed back to their planet in their spaceship, and there accidentally was like these humans that like attached themselves to the spaceship, and so they accidentally brought like this huge bunch of tourists, and so that like the bad guys in that game were like they were just really frustrating caricatures of like Earthlings. Like people that have like take pictures of you. I remember the most frustrating one was this person that would like run around and take a picture of you and it would like stun you. It was hilarious because like you'd sit there just like like blinking and but the music, like I just remember the music to this day. Occasionally I'll throw it on like a playlist that I have for something and just be kind of like which one doesn't belong. It will be in the middle of a playlist that's not that type of music, and then all of a sudden it's like, what's this 8-bit funk music?
Yeah, it's just like just throw it in there.
MIDI funk.
Let's see here. When did this? Let's do some research here on For the People. When did this come out?
1998.
Wow.
So this is okay. TC, you're gonna steal everybody who's the person who's listening right now. Let's figure out. Has not talked yet, so maybe they can hear, maybe they can't. But
they're just watching our pretty faces.
Yeah. Accidentally stumbled on the.
Maybe it's that bot that came on the.
Yeah. Oh yeah. What is it called? Dating for sex. That's like DFS. What's your favorite game?
It replied like, "What's your favorite board game?" Oh God, that was awesome.
It was like, hey. There's Colin. It's Colin who's here.
Oh, hey. Yeah. We're gonna do some spoilers, Colin. We're doing some late research for the People.
Well, my intro was gonna be like 1 score ago.
Yeah, because
it's like the 10th anniversary. But yeah, ruined my big moment, which I'll probably even forget that I was gonna say that. 1 score ago. Our forefathers imagined upon this land. Our forefather Mark Herman.
Mark Herman imagined upon this hobby.
Yeah. Or whatever it is. I don't know the words to it. I'm awful. At one point I did have the Gettysburg Address in my head, but not anymore.
Hey,
4 score and 6 years ago.
Are you going to WBC?
I am, yeah.
Yeah, you've got to report on that because I heard last year there was a For the People tournament that was just unbelievable. Like the last match was just something to behold.
Really? Well,
yeah.
I think that WBC is whenever you get to the championship tables of any of the games, it would be something super intense. Like when it's down to people who really get what's going on. Oh man, Hansa Teutonica tournament. I could see myself partaking, Colin. I could see that being a thing. Good old Hansa Teutonica. I mean that would be such a crazy game. It's like the Euro version of Diplomacy because it's so savvy.
You have to have like Jeff tied to a chair in front of you, like playing the game. He's like, no.
Yeah, I should play with Jeff and then let Jeff beat me, so he has to play more Hansa Teutonica.
Just keep throwing it.
Throw the game. Keep on like setting up all the games so that Jeff has to keep on advancing in the tournament.
Like,
and play
no, I just want
more Hansa Teutonica.
No, we're all throwing it. We've all agreed that you're going to win every single one.
Yeah, you're the Hansa Teutonica national champion, Jeff.
And you have to like wear it as a badge of honor. Like, no, it's shameful. I hate the game. No, but you're the best.
We're just shooting things around here. A few pipe dream ideas. Jonathan, how are you tonight?
Hey guys, I'm really sorry about being a little bit late. Pregnant wife, not doing very well at the end of her first trimester, and needed to take care of some things at the house. So
sure, hey,
everything's good to go now.
If it doesn't, we'll if it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. You got, those are things that take precedence.
Yeah, no, I hear you. No, like I said, she's going to bed now. I had to get some stuff taken care of, but we're good to go.
Hey, that's okay.
Right.
I just grabbed my daughter to babysit my son over Munchkin cards, so there's no shame in this.
TC, I have to say, I'm pretty happy that you got to play some Hands in the Sea, man.
Yeah, it was the craziest thing because we just did that episode, right? And I'm like, oh man, I really want to get it. And I go to our local game store, one of the local game stores here, Guardian Games. I'm just looking around. I'm like, and I see a used copy of Hands in the Sea for $35. Just like in shrink. I mean, no, it was in shrink because everything was carded, sleeved, everything. The only problem I had is I was trying to figure out which of the cards were the corrected cards because I wasn't sure that they were replaced or not. That was the biggest hurdle. But yeah, I've played it like 3 or 4 times since I've talked to you, and I did not realize Sicily was going to be such a freaking bloodbath that game makes it. Holy
it's like a knife fight in a phone booth, man.
Yeah, I mean, that whole game, like 90% of that game is just Sicily just beating the crap out of each other in Sicily. And if you're playing Rome and you lose that foothold, oh, it's an uphill battle. It's not good.
Yeah, definitely. It starts out as Rome's on the back foot, and Rome has to quickly start catching up. But I was talking to Joe. Maybe I didn't mention it to Joe. I played 2 games against the designer, Daniel Berger.
Wow.
I sent him a thing afterwards, and I was like, "Hey, I hope you like this. I talked about this game. Thanks for making this game." And he's like, "Hey, let's go on and play sometime." And he beat me in 5 rounds. Like it was already the radio was on the wall. I was like, "Oh, that was so bad." And then we played again. This time I made it all the way to round 10, and he only beat me by like 17. We actually made it to legit. He didn't auto victory me, so I felt much better.
Yeah, he didn't. Yeah, you had to work for the beatdown. That's a good sign. That's a good sign.
But man,
there are several things I like about that one. Not to get too sidetracked, but I love the events, how they come out. Man, those freaking elephants that Carthage has, they could be like nothing or devastating. Yeah, it's just like you don't know. You're just like, oh no, because they roll a die and that's the value. Freaking Stephen was rolling like 6s and 5s, and my Roman soldiers were like, yeah, we're out of here. See you later.
Yeah, I made the mistake. Against him. My early strategy was Carthage, you can land grab quickly because you have more boats, and you can very quickly in Sicily kind of leapfrog some of those spaces. And I started hunkering down and throwing down fortifications. Well, I forgot that elephants get a penalty in fortifications, and cavalry are only worth half. Yeah.
That's Carthage's strength. The rules. I was like, Steven, no!
So you played against your own.
Yeah, so I started fortifying to make myself stronger, and he just built up his legions and just tore into me. And that didn't work out very well. But
that is such a great re-implementation of A Few Acres of Snow.
Yeah,
it's I think that is really underrated, and I would play that at the drop of a hat with just about anyone. And even my wife Carissa's like, that looks really interesting. I'm like, yeah, it should be. It's like a better version of this game right here.
Well, good. Well, if either of you guys go to BGG Con, let me know. I'm going to bring it. I'm only about 5 hours away, so I'll be muling that and a few other games.
Oh man,
nice.
I'm over here all the way on the West Coast with
unlikely.
2 kids. Cons are a little pipe dream right now.
Well, this is my first big one.
They might have some of the. They might have Hands in the Sea tournaments. I don't know if they do that at WBC.
It narrowly missed being a trial event last year. It was like 2 votes short. So I need to follow back up with someone because they almost made it last year. I'm hoping with this second edition coming out, maybe that will give it a little more oomph to get in maybe next year. I know Daniel Berger is going to be there. He goes to WBC almost every year. So yeah, I haven't listened to y'all's latest Good Word Ugly just yet because it just dropped a couple days ago and I've been busy.
Sure.
I saw that you had on your hype that you had WBC. So if you're going, you should take a look for him. He's a really, really fun guy to talk to.
Yeah, for sure. And it sounds like if he taught me the game, I would probably last maybe what two turns,
three rounds,
turns?
Three rounds, three, 4 rounds. Hey, I did 5.
Round 1 auto victory.
Yeah, I had 15 games under my belt when I went in against him, and he shellacked me. So I feel like if you go in and last 4 rounds on a curve, that's like lasting 8. So
no, that's getting close to it. So
yeah, so just a heads up. I'm going to be trying to host this sucker. Should be interesting.
Yeah,
and I have not technically played For the People. I've looked at it once, but I have played Mark Herman's other CDGs. I've played We the People, and it was interesting. I went from We the People and I skipped For the People and went straight to Empire of the Sun, and my brain collapsed. So,
so I still have Empire of the Sun sitting. I mean, we just were remodeling for the baby, and I'm actually looking at all my games are finally out of a closet and are actually displayed in all their glory. And I pulled the shrink off Empire of the Sun, but it literally has not seen. Like, I pulled out the rule book and I was like, "You have got to be kidding me!"
Yeah,
just shut the box. Like, okay,
I peek at it and go, "Oh
yeah.
my god!" I actually tried 3 rounds and went, "Okay, I'm gonna put this aside for a while because I am not ready to dedicate." To this yet. It's like that's a commitment,
Yeah, there's a video. There's a series of videos I have saved on my like a board game, a board game YouTube channel I have or whatever. That's just like for looking at board games, and I have it basically saved to watch later. Supposedly this guy goes through it all. Like, they're really long. There's a bunch of them, but I need to have some time when I have like a weekend to myself to just kind of watch those and push it around, because For the People was actually pretty tough, but I found a guy from Finland who was like, I'll do a teaching game on the Vassal request list, and he was great. He was really helpful, and of course he throttled me hard, but like he'd be like, well, if you do that, like, you may want to take that move back because I can cut your supply line here, here, and here. And I was like, oh yeah, that'd be bad. Okay, I'll take it back. And he still beat me bad, but For the People's, I don't think it's. If I'd say on the GMT type of scale, I'd say For the People is probably a 3 or a 4, and Empire of the Sun's probably getting as close to a 5 as GMT makes, from what I've been told by people. But I've also heard it's like the one. A lot of people swear by it as like the best Pacific theater game out there. So
yeah, and I think GMT has this really funny system on the back of complexity that goes like from 1 to 10, I think. And anything that crosses 8 is like your life. Is what.
Yeah. Campaign for North Africa. They have to have like a. They have to make that scale work for Campaign for North Africa, so it's just like that 9 is like, phew.
Yeah. I think it's not linear for some reason. Maybe they say it is, but I think even their most complex game, I don't think they have any 10s. I think they're all 9 and below.
Yeah.
So
I think Here I Stand's either an 8 or 9. I know it's not a 10. I'm just after doing that, I'm like, I don't even want to know what a 10 is. That's just like, wow, like that World in Flames or whatever that freaking game is called.
Yeah, for World in Flames, yeah.
Well, it's tough to know if the scale goes to 11.
Okay.
10.
Well, if you know the CDG variant, I'll refer to that a lot. Probably.
Yeah, and
it's just comparisons, but
you girls probably kind of convince old Joe here to play it, and then I know Chris is going to want to be. I know this is pretty high on her bucket list of games to play, so she'll be listening to this as well. And
awesome.
And just listen to me fumble because she thinks it's funny when I host, and she thinks I can host, so it's always fun.
I just wanted to show you, Joe. Joe, are you from Iowa, or are you just live in Iowa?
I am. Yeah,
he is Iowa.
You lived here for a while. There you go. Yeah,
repping the Iowa football shirt, baby.
That is disgusting. Suck up.
I'm from Iowa. I'm from Iowa, so it's okay.
Yeah. You're from Northwest, right?
Northwest corner, yeah. Little farm in town. I lived in the country actually, but it's like I said. I think I told you last time. I have my brother, my sister just got married a couple years ago. Married to a guy who they now live in Boone, and she just got sent to the Iowa Medical School. So they're transitioning to the east side of Des Moines now. So he can still work at his job in Des Moines, and she can go to her medical school there. So.
Oh, cool! Yeah, one of the teachers I teach with, his wife goes to that medical school, and I think is going to be getting done soon. But Yeah, that's cool. I'm originally from the southeast corner, so we grew up about as far from each other as you can get.
Yep.
But yeah, still have the same apparel. You know, my dad graduated from the U of I for the law school there. So, and that's like, I mean, we don't have professional teams here. You know,
that's right.
It's just what we got. You know, if you live in Iowa, it's college football or nothing. College football, college basketball,
and the iCubs. I guess maybe kind of.
We had the Burlington Bees.
That's right. That's
really
right.
Small minor league team. I think the smallest professional. So the professional team that's in the smallest town by population in the whole country.
That wouldn't surprise me. Burlington's pretty small. I have some extended family from Mediapolis and Oakville. That's from my
Meepo.
My whole mom's side. They're all originally from the southeast part of Iowa.
That's crazy. Yeah, you don't get this far with an Iowa person usually. You don't.
Yeah.
You don't get to do this very often, TC. Let me have my moments.
Hey, have your moment. I understand. I'm a native Texan. Every time I hear from Texas, I'm like, oh, I get to talk to some people.
Well, and I live in Texas now. I live in
It's pretty much a mixture. Yeah, we're like
we're displayed.
Yeah, we've like a triangle going there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I always appreciate a person that understands the agony of Amarillo, Texas. So
Well, hey, Amarillo is at least dry. In Corpus, I was talking to my brother, and he's like, "Oh, I got over 90 degrees already in Iowa." And I pulled up my phone, my app, and I was like, "It's like 50% humidity up there. It's 92 in Corpus right now, and it's 65% humidity. That is atrocious."
That's that's hot and not sweating.
Yeah, where you drink the air.
Yeah, it's brutal, and it's going to be like that for about 4 months. So,
yeah, this is that time of year. My buddy just moved from Iowa down to Arizona, and it was getting to be like mid to late May, and I called him, and I was like, "Man, it's finally we hit above 40 for a whole week," and he's like telling me like, "Yeah, it's starting to get to the point where I don't want to go outside anymore."
Yeah, no, I hear you. I hear you.
Give me 1 second and we'll start.
Okie dokie. So, I was doing a little bit of research just for the purpose of this, and I am interested in For the People. I mean, it's really tough for me, Jonathan. I really want to play Hands in the Sea, but I have a hard time with 2-player games just in general, like heavy 2-player games, because so many, they're not really game night games. They're more like have a buddy over and. Yeah, like I find that difficult to fit in, and they're also they're tough nuts to crack. But I really want to play Hands in the Sea. I still haven't gotten to it. I still think that the new Kickstarter didn't.
I just got because I got the upgrade kit right. So I just got an update email from Don Lloyd who runs Nightworks. And he just said on a thing that it's been delayed shipping out the upgrade kit. Yeah. And I would assume that means also the game has been delayed because there was an issue where everything came out good on the proofs except the cards were not with a thicker stock they were supposed to. And so he basically was like, look, that's not what we got. That's not what our backers paid for. So I told him to, redo them and then we're going to get them out. So if you go to his website still, I think I sent you that link either on email or Facebook. If you go to that website, you should still be able to pre-order it.
Oh my God! You did an outline. Oh no!
Yeah, that's more only for me. Honestly, you don't even need to use
looking at this going, guys.
No, you don't.
I read through it. I really. There's a lot of good food for thought there, dude. I'm once again looking forward to all the homework you did, dude.
Well, you gave me the you said if there was a ribbon for best prepared, it would go to me. So I couldn't really you can't put that out there and then me just go and crap all over it.
Yeah, like this is the time when you say, hey, that was just a one-time thing.
Okay, so we got. Okay, I'm good. You're Jonathan, right?
That's right.
All right, and we got Joe. Okay, I got this.
Yeah,
okay, we ready?
I'm still Joe. Yep.
Okay, here we go. I gotta do the long Joe countdown, and we'll get going. And I got plenty of stuff to edit for the beginning, so it should be amazingly fun. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Welcome to an episode of The Long View. Tonight I am very, very excited because we're going to be talking about a Mark Herman game. Yes, one of my favorite designers, and I will be discussing it with our good friend Jonathan, who has been on previously talking about Hands in the Sea. I will also be joined by my really good friend Joe, who is gracious enough to let me take the reins of this podcast and run into the ground. Joe from Iowa. So, hello, Jonathan. Thank you for being on.
Hey guys, good to be here.
Thank you for mentioning Hands in the Sea. Has quickly become one of my favorite games. And hey, Joe, how's Iowa?
Not too bad. Listeners, pay no attention to the gun that TC is holding to my head right now. Just he's doing a great job. I'm really, really pumped to listen to this episode where TC takes the long view and does wonderful things like I could never do.
Oh, yeah. Well, I don't know if I call it wonderful. I'd like to briefly mention that we are sponsored by Game Surplus, which you've heard in the intro. Game Surplus is a great, great place to find really awesome, hard-to-find games. I know I found my company, John Company. He's been hanging on. Carmen's been hanging on to some other games that are coming out. So if you're looking for a good game that's hard to find, and you want it shipped to you in a very pretty box that will not crush and is be very properly packed, I highly recommend Game Surplus.
As do I. Yes,
yeah.
The packaging is just fantastic. Everything comes the way that it was supposed to.
All right. So, Jonathan, we are here to talk about For the People. Now, we need to discuss a little bit about the game itself, because I have some pretty interesting history behind it, if you don't know it.
Yeah, you might be able to shed even more than I know. I guess the brief history I would say is 1998 is when it came out. Mark Herman originally was Avalon Hill, right before Avalon Hill closed shop.
Yeah, it was the last game that Avalon Hill made before they closed shop and got bought out. So for the longest time, this game was very hard to come by.
Okay.
Yeah, I remember talking to Mark Herman about it, and it was quite an accomplishment. He really wanted to get this game republished by GMT, and one of the biggest troubles he was having was getting the license for it. And when he got the We the People, he got For the People. And whereas he redesigned We the People into Washington's War, he just pretty much re-released For the People with like some of the facts and errata that had come out over the years that the game was being played. And of course, since that time, like I think Hannibal versus Rome had come out and some other CDGs. And for people who don't realize it, Mark Herman was the innovator behind the card-driven game system. People might recognize it from Twilight Struggle. That I think is one of his more popular implementations. But among war gamers, it was really effective towards games like World War I had Paths of Glory. And it really changed the way games were played, war gamers, because they're usually hex and chit games with dice. And the CDG system actually came out and actually implemented events. So you had a choice. But yeah, that's a little brief history behind that. I always thought it's kind of interesting. So what was your experience?
First one was We the People, right?
Yes, that is correct.
Yeah, he came out with that like 2 years before this, and right after For the People came, then like TC said, Hannibal Rome versus Carthage, which I'm still waiting for my copy. That thing has been taking forever to come out. That re-release. Mm-hmm. And For the People, they started playing it almost immediately at WBC, and it's been played now for 20 years. And what's pretty incredible about this is Mark Herman. I mean, the amount of support this guy puts behind his games is really no one can touch. It's par excellence. You know, he still answers to this day. I remember I asked him questions a year ago when I was running this thing, and he popped on a couple times and was like, yeah, this, yeah, that, this is the reason behind this rule. And I mean, for a guy to still be this involved for a game he put out 20 years ago is incredible. And he's learned a lot from watching it get played competitively at WBC. And so while it hasn't changed a ton, it wasn't a complete rework over the editions. This game has been finally polished. In the final edition, I don't think there's any errata or FAQ, honestly. It's been so well polished when the last edition came out in I think 2015 or whatever, is when I got my copy on the third edition. And I was actually the first true wargame I ever bought. I was in college, and I had been playing Access Now with my friends. We had a lot of fun. We were playing the anniversary edition. We'd get together, stay up super late and stuff. And I was like, I started getting kind of tired of how there was no flavor. There was no asymmetry other than like your starting locations. All the units were the same. There was no, it just started to rub me wrong a little bit. And I got For the People, and I pulled up that rule book, and my head just started to spin. And I eventually sold it. That was the second edition version. I never got it. I couldn't get anyone to help me with it. I didn't know about BGG. I didn't know about any of that. Yeah. So I sold it. Mm-hmm. And finally, when I started taking another whack at it, this was actually for either first or second game I bought again when I was going to try it again. And then it sat on my shelf for 2 years because I was so intimidated by the rule book. And finally I went online and found a guy, and I'll give a shout out to Jukka Hitinka from Finland. He helped me play a bunch of learning games and just absolutely mopped the floor with me. It took me 7 games before I finally beat him. And, you know, he was really a good teacher, did a great job.
Yeah, that's the one thing I've noticed with Mark Herman designs in particular is that it takes a while. I mean, we were briefly discussing before this Empire of the Sun, where, you know, there's this the jump just to getting to know it is quite extensive, but once you get into it, it's really worth the effort. Washington's War was that way a little bit too. But what happened with me was I went from Washington's War to the Empires of the Sun. I kind of skipped over For the People, which might have been a mistake because, man, I mean, Mark Herman has like this amazing map for Empire of the Sun that like takes up his whole basement with giant chits. And like you said, he still supports his game. And even in that newest edition of Empire of the Sun, he has a solo variant called for a bot to run that whole thing. And of course, it's all flow charts. You just stare at it and go, "Oh my god!" But once you get over the initial hump of learning these games, they really are quite rewarding. And I imagine For the People's the same way because this game has gotten a lot of love over the years, and the fact that we're still talking about it to this day, I think, is a testament to its design.
Yeah, it's a quintessential. I mean, I don't even. It's almost old enough. I don't know if you can call it a modern classic, but I feel like this is a game you're going to be playing 100. If the world lasts longer, 100 years from now. This game is so good. I played some other games about the Civil War, and we'll kind of be talking about this, but I've logged now 14 full plays, and I've got a bunch of other that are still ongoing. And I'm also, I was playing, teaching a guy, but I think that one of the best ways to learn this TC is to find someone who knows how to play it, and you can get into the game really fast. It's actually not the engine of it, and I'll kind of overview it when we get to that. Yeah. It's not that complicated. It really isn't. It's all the chrome that Mark throws in there. But you need that chrome because
it's history.
You need that history because without it, the game would degenerate. And he talks about it in some of his different notes. You can find different articles from C3I and stuff where he's like, look, here's the reason why I made these riverine rules. But people say they're so complicated. But without it, the Confederacy can go all over into Missouri and up past Kentucky and into the, Ohio and stuff. And that just never would have happened without significant, forts and ironclad fleets and things like that. And he explains about it. And then you appreciate why he put this loving detail into these rules. And he's done an amazing job of the rule book, so well written. And like I said, he puts really good clarifying examples into his rule book. So I actually taught a lot of that game to myself and then went into the teaching game. And for how tough of that game that is, that was pretty impressive because his rule book is so detailed and so well thought out.
Yeah, and I'm assuming that rulebook also has like an example of play in it because most G&T games do.
He has a whole the first war. He plays out the year of 1861 the way that it actually went, like to history. So cool. He actually, that's pretty cool in the very beginning of the rulebook. So I would skip the example of play at first, kind of breeze through a little bit of the rules, and then go and just try the example of play and push the counters around. And he does the whole first year of the war in the playbook. That's why the rulebook's partially is why it's so long. And then also he also gives you, if you don't want to play the whole campaign, he lets you start it in 1861 and play for a year and gives you the victory conditions, 1862, just 63, et cetera, et cetera. So, a lot of that rule book is just a lot of examples of play and all, if you condense the whole thing down, it'd probably be 30 pages or less.
Once you get through the scenarios,
examples and scenarios, you're looking at about a
designer notes. That's one of my favorite things reading in GMT games is designer
notes. Mark Herman, I listen to his interviews. Sometimes I re-listen to him because the guy, he knows so much about ancients. He knows so much about the Pacific War. He knows so much about the Revolutionary War. I mean, the guy, I know why Judd calls him Hermanosaurus Rex.
Just get him talking about the Peloponnesian War.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's like, you can just listen to him talk for hours. It's like, yes, that's interesting. So before we get too much further in this, let's just describe what this game is a little bit in case people aren't familiar with it. So, Jonathan, why don't you, assuming no one knows what this game is, you can describe what are we talking about here?
Okay. That's a good idea before we get too far away.
Before we start talking about how great it is, what is it we're talking about, right?
So this is a capital CDG. This is an actual CDG, not just a game with cards, but that is the engine of the game. And that is basically referred to any genre of a game where you have a deck of cards that forms what your capabilities are for a round or a season, whatever you want to call it. In this case, it's seasons. And you get that hand, you're each dealt, you don't know what each other has, and you take turns alternating playing your cards until you've each exhausted your hand. And then that marks the end of the turn, and you go through your end of turn sequence, and then you go to your beginning of your turn, and then you deal out your cards again. And that's how it goes. And those cards typically, such as like Washington's War, which is extremely popular and has been played a lot, those are either operations cards or event cards. It's either or. The way For the People works is every single card has both an event and an operations, and you choose either the event or the ops. So there is no, there is not like Washington's War where sometimes you just get a handful of ops and you're just going to be playing these generic points. Every single card has an event in it and an ops associated with it, and you can always choose. And all of the events, with the exception of a few, are germane to one side. So if you get your other side's cards, you're just going to be using for ops. But there's some that are both.
Does the event automatically go off when you use them for ops if it's your opponent's?
No. Even if it's your own card or your opponent's card, if you want to play for ops, it will not use it. The only time that it automatically goes is two mandatory events, and that's for foreign intervention, which is if the Confederates can ever get their strategic will high enough to represent that they're doing really well in a European power season opportunity to step in, which they almost did. But it's really hard. It happens very rarely because you have to boost your strategic will so high. Then even if the Union is holding that, they have to play the card. Same thing for Emancipation Proclamation, which hurts the Confederates a lot in the same way that Lincoln couldn't just do it. Politically, he couldn't just do it and look like he was flailing. He had to wait for a victory. So as soon as he had a strategic, it was a tactical draw, but a strategic victory to turn back Lee at Antietam, also known as Sharpsburg. Because of that, he was then able to step out and make this proclamation, which he had already had drafted for a little bit. He'd been wanting to do this. And so in that case, that card is the other mandatory event in the game. And that card has to be played even if the Confederates hold it after a medium or large battle victory.
So you're probably going to want to, if you have this card in your hand, you're going to want to know knowledge of the deck.
Yeah, but one thing I'm going to point out about these cards is it can actually hurt you. I was in a tournament game. I was playing the tournaments because the WBC does both a tournament at the in Pennsylvania, but they also do an online tournament. And it was actually hurting me because I was paralyzed in fear of a couple different cards I knew the guy might have. And I realized later that I was being way too cautious with Grant's army because I was so afraid of these cards coming out. And so sometimes it actually hurts you. Like sometimes you play better almost like forgetting about certain cards because you kind of sit back there. And it kind of reminds me of there was a story where Grant kind of takes over the shell-shocked army, and they're still Lee had become like this legend. Like kind of like the way that the Wehrmacht was in the early parts of World War II, where people started to almost be defeated before they even went into the battle. They thought these guys were super generals. Yeah. And they're talking about, well, what if Lee does this and what if Lee does that? And Grant walks up and he said, do you think that Lee's going to suddenly somersault over our heads and land behind us? He goes, I don't want you to think about what he's going to do. I want you to go back to your tent and then come back and tell me what you're going to do. And he kind of tries to shake him out of this. And I was kind of falling to that same prey of Lee is such a good general and there's these different cards. And what if he has a campaign card? And so sometimes you can actually be hurt by knowing a lot of the deck because you know all the things that can come out and hit you. You can't play for every eventuality. If you do, you will just stay there as the Union. You will be like what McClellan and a lot of these other generals were, which was just paralyzed of I can't leave DC. I can't protect it. So that's what I would say about the event cards. There's a lot of events and it gives a ton of flavor. But knowing the whole deck is not, I don't think, at all crucial, except for knowing that the Emancipation Proclamation and Foreign Intervention, which are the two mandatory events.
Those two cards are about the only two that you really need to know, which I would say that almost every card-driven game is going to have, at some level, at least some of those huge game-changing events that you're going to want to tell your opponent about. So that way it's not read this card.
Yeah, you might want to be aware of this.
I'm going to play this and win.
So this is a game about the Civil War. What are the victory conditions for each side in order to win the game?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite things about the whole game, and what makes it tick so well is it's strategic will. That's the whole thing in this game. The game boils down to strategic will, and if you can ever force the other side down to 0, you've won the game. At any time, if the Confederates can get the Union down to half of whatever the Confederate strategic will is, that also ends the game. Ooh. If at the end of the fall 64 turn, when Lincoln faces re-election, if they are below 50, the Union. No matter what the Confederates are at, they could be hanging on by a thread. If they can get it below 50, they've won the war of attrition, and Lincoln loses to the Peace Democrats, and as they were called, which was McClellan, the former general, he became the Democrat candidate. He lost to Lincoln, but there's the chance that he could have lost. Maybe if the war didn't go as well in the end, if Grant doesn't start getting him some of the victories that he had, especially in the Mississippi campaign. So he plays all that out. And if the game ever does get all the way to 65, then there's a process for counting up. But it so rarely gets there. The war typically will end with either the Confederates scoring an early victory in 62 or early 63, or the Union is able to pull the fight out of them, or you're able to get the Lincoln to lose. I've only seen one game so far get to 65, and it doesn't seem that common.
So how long do you think a game lasts when you have people who know it?
I would say it really can be quite variable because of the victory conditions. If you go with an aggressive play as the Confederates, games shouldn't last more than about 3 to 4 hours. If you decide to try to do an alternate strategy where you're trying to hold on and wait out the North and get war weariness to take its toll and beat Lincoln, get Lincoln to lose the election, now you're talking about a game that probably lasts about 6 hours. So It just depends. It's so much fun, though. It really doesn't feel like that kind of time. It really doesn't. The game is so immersive, and I feel like strategic will works so well because it always feels kind of gamey sometimes when you just have victory point cities or victory points where you're just kind of like, ooh, like I was going to lose the game and now I grabbed these 2 victory points. Like, okay, how's that going to work at the peace table? And in certain cases, I understand it's not a bad way to represent things, but I think in a war like the Civil War, where you really started to see industrial warfare, which eventually would be even more so, like this was basically the precursor to World War I. In fact, you start seeing trench warfare at the end of the Civil War. But this was also one of the very first wars in modern history, or and I guess what you call when you get into the Renaissance and then into the Enlightenment. This is one of the very first wars where you start to see total war break out, and that actually gets reflected in a couple of rule changes. In 64, you can start just marching as you go and just start tearing up the enemy's supply lines. Like you no longer have to even be in supply. You can basically recreate Sherman's march to the sea and things like that. So this is a different era of warfare where it no longer was about trying to win set piece battles necessarily, like say even Napoleon or someone like that, or you're trying to capture certain cities and then maybe you go to the peace table and you make some changes, concessions of territory. You start seeing like this war, and we've seen World War I. It's like these tests of wills, and it's about who can continue to fight and who's going to finally just give up. Because the South still had a lot of territory when the war was over, but their backs were broken. The blockade was tearing them up, was strangling them. And that can happen in this game where basically the blockade can get to the point where you're getting no reinforcements or any trade through your blockade ports. You're losing states. You're losing the ability to get reinforcements from them. The game really, you start to feel that pressure almost immediately as the Confederates of, while time might be on my side in the sense that I can try to fight for re-election, eventually all of the Union's overwhelming manpower advantages and the naval advantages you start to feel like there's an anaconda around your neck as a Confederate player. And you see why, Lee and those guys wanted to try to go and fight for those decisive blows in the North, and why they wanted it, because in the long term, the Union has such a manpower advantage. I think this is something like 19 million men of fighting age approximately that they could draw from, whereas the South had around 8 million. Of course, and then the thing was, it's hard to replicate. It's hard to replicate how big of an advantage and so many advantages the Union had. The only thing that keeps the South in it for a while is the fact that they have better generals, but also more aggressive generals. Generals are easier to move. And so one thing I should have said about the cards is when you have operations, one of the biggest things you'll be doing with operations is you're going to be moving your generals around. And the Union starts out with they're not even all that they're so much incompetent, but they all have 2s or 3s that are required to activate them. 2s and 3s, well, at any given time, about a half of your hand isn't going to have a 2 or a 3. It might be 1s, in which case your general's going to be very slow to move. And so even if you have lots of men, and Lincoln was always trying to press his generals to do more, they were always, wanted more supplies, wanted better intel, things like that. That's what it represents. Your generals are super hesitant. And it's kind of like the British in Washington.
Which is what I was about to say. That sounds familiar. Where you had to like play like the general had like a number on it, and that's the card number you had to play, and it wasn't the number of spaces you moved because you always moved a set number of spaces. That's the card you needed to activate it just to move around the board. And Cornwallis in that one is like a 3 or something, and just to get him to move with his army is quite the effort. But man, if you can get him marching, he can really make people start sweating a bit with him. But that sounds like the. And how's the battle system work in this one? Because we're hitting a little bit on how the generals move around and how you activate them, and I'm really curious how the battle system works in this thing.
Yeah. So real quick, I'll say you have point-to-point movement. Everything on there is either regular spaces or you've got capital cities for the north, as well as you have your national capital for each side. Those will give you some combat benefits, and then you have resource spaces for the south that represent key points that give you your ultimate supply, as well as they're what if they ever get burned, think of Savannah or Atlanta, whatever. Those will be massive hits to your strategic will and boost the Union. But the way the battles work is your troops meet in combat. You also have interception rules and things like that can happen. You can attempt a discretionary retreat. So the pre-battle game is actually really fun compared to a lot of other games where you have lots of like, will he try to intercept me? A lot of generals are quite competent at doing that. And if they have cavalry with them, they get a DRM help to make it easier. So even bad generals, if they have cavalry, they have like a 1/3 chance of intercepting you. But once you meet in battle, you get to use the general with the highest political rating. So that's the problem as the Union as well, as some of your highest political generals, they're also kind of your worst generals in many cases. And it's not just for them. Like for the South, Braxton Bragg is one of the highest rated political generals, as he was, and they had a hard time canning him, even though he had disaster after disaster. But he's still one of your highest rated ones. So it's your highest political rated general takes command. And he adds a DRM to your combat as long as it's core versus core combat. You also have some dice for if you have a fort present, your force ratio. If at any time you have 3-to-1 or greater troop odds, you're going to get a bonus to your troops. And then you go ahead and you each roll a single D6, and your combat results are from a 1 up to a 10. And if you get 10 or higher modified, it is what it is. It's just a 10. And so what happens is early on, the Union, unless they have a big, overwhelming troop advantage at the moment of combat, they're basically rolling with like a +0 or a +1 DRM. And so their max, like the max they can get is say, a 7 on the DRM chart. Whereas someone like Lee, he's a 3. He's a 3 on offense and defense. He's really good. So even if you roll at worst, you roll a 1, you're going to get a modified 4. The Union general is probably rolling about, if he rolls a 3 or a 4 right in the middle, he's basically equaled Lee on Lee's worst day. So that's kind of what that's representing. The other thing I should mention is that's if you have cores, in which case then it's your highest army. If you build armies, and this is one of the other fun things about the game, and there's a whole mess of stuff of what you do is you actually, once you get enough troops together and enough generals in the space, you build an army. You have to have at least 5, basically represents about 5 brigades worth of troops, 5 strength points. Once you do that, you can then choose 2 subordinates to go into army or the flanks. And so then you actually get to use 3 total generals. Well, this just makes the Confederates even better because they get guys like Jackson and Longstreet very early, whereas the Union, some of their best guys were still coming up through the ranks. Guys like Sherman and Grant were still at a lower level. They were lieutenant generals, things like that. They weren't. They hadn't been promoted yet to the level of receiving full army commands. Grant was still sitting underneath Halleck and I think one other guy at this time, at their first year of the war. And so the Confederates have a huge advantage in army-to-army combat because not only is Lee better than anything the Union can throw up, but if he chooses to use Jackson and Longstreet, which he doesn't necessarily have to, he could send them over somewhere else. But if he's using them, now he's got an even higher DRM. He could theoretically, if he has Longstreet and Jackson and Lee on the attack, he could be at a +8 before he even rolls a die.
Wow.
But here's the beauty. This is the beauty of the system that Mark Herman designed is he looked at it as a lot of times the more aggressive commanders also got killed a lot. And so what he does is unless you have a massive overwhelming force advantage, anytime you roll a 10 or higher on the combat modified combat roll, you have to take a 50-50 loss check for a random subordinate general. And that is brutal. I've lost Jackson so many times I can't even count. And of course, he actually did die. He rode back at dusk from scouting out an advanced position, something a Union general probably wouldn't have done, and he got killed by one of his own soldiers. Longstreet took a bullet in the neck and almost died. Albert Sidney Johnston, the Texan, he actually died at Shiloh leading a charge on the second day to try to break the Union position. So the Confederates had more aggressive generals, especially early on. They also lost more generals. And so that's reflected by the Confederates can win a lot early, but you start to lose generals just by the odds of it, by the nature of it. And so you really, as the Confederates, you want to try to gain a force advantage, because if you have at least 3-to-1 forces, that's a key ratio, then no matter what you roll, you will not have to take a loss check. The idea is that you have such an overwhelming force, your general doesn't have to, do anything, I guess, brave and gallant and try to lead from the front as they often would. You basically steamroll the opposition.
Is there like a maximum number of soldiers you can have? Because I go like We the People or you can only have like 5.
Yeah, you can move a max of 5. Thing.
Yeah, okay.
So this is another beauty of the game. If you have a general, you can do what's called a core move. Represents basically a core, which often a lot of times they would move, and they can move faster. They can move up to 8 spaces. If they move along railroad lines, they can move 10, and the maximum amount of troops though is 6. That's about 6 divisions. That's approximately about 30,000 men fighting strength. So you think of moves by like Longstreet Corps or Hooker's Corps. Those guys would move a lot of times with cores. They move very fast, but those cores cannot use multiple generals. So you only get to use one general as you attack, and you only have 6 troops. So it's hard to get a force ratio advantage. If you want to get that force ratio advantage, like we're talking about, you can move up to 15 up to 15 strength points, which is a massive army.
That's a big army, yeah.
You'll rarely get there with the South. You just trying to muster that kind of men. You'd have to basically pull from every state and leave yourself still weak everywhere else. The Union can get 15 men, no problem. If you want to do that, you can, but armies are slower, so they only move at 6 spaces. So corps are lightning fast. They can move. You want to try to break supply lines with corps. What you want to use is the army is kind of your hammer. So you use your corps to move around and try to take positions. Your army is slower and kind of more methodical, but it brings the pain in terms of it brings up to you can bring more 15 up to 15 strength points, and you can use extra generals to add to your die roll modifiers. So that's pretty critical.
Yeah, so but really it sounds interesting to me right now. And one thing I want to try to hit on is that even if you're playing the South and you feel like you're being hit with like an overwhelming force, which sounds like it's going to happen the longer this game's on, you still have that willpower, the will to fight that kind of holds that in check. So I was wondering, because there's another game that came out called the Civil War, and I looked at that and went, holy cow, I don't know if I want to touch that thing. But there's been several war games I've played where it's like, there just comes a point where like I concede because there's just no point at doing this. But this game in particular seems to have that really cool mechanism where you can still throw in a last Hail Mary and get going. And so one of the things I want to get part is like there's multiple passive victors and different ways of doing it, which gives this game an extreme amount of replayability. So what do you think about the replayability on this sucker?
Yeah, oh my gosh, the replayability on this game. This is a game I'm gonna play this till I die. There's no way I'm never not gonna be playing this game till I die, because
unless you're an aggressive Confederate general, because that's
this is true, shot,
dude.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. This game is it's so good. Because there are so many ways to pursue victory. You can try so many different strategies. And there's a beautiful mix of what Mark Herman talks about is so often what actually happened was not the likely outcome. If you look at like a bell curve of okay, Lee marches north, there's a bell curve of distribution of what might have happened. You can't say that every time, like, oh, this is like what actually happened. That was certainly the thing that was right in the middle. And he throws a lot of little bit of chaos items in there that can happen. Some of the events can really come out and hit you out of nowhere. He also throws in some really cool what-if scenarios, like I said, about, for instance, the foreign intervention. That is an absolutely brutal thing that can happen to the Union. The only way for that to happen, though, is you have to march north and raid some Union territory. It's the only way you're going to get your strategic will, which starts at 100, and get it up to 110. Basically, this whole game, you're going to be getting hits. You're each going to be brutalizing each other down. And eventually, how a lot of games end is, one guy's almost at 0 and the other guy finally hits 0. So to keep in mind, it's a brutal game on your strategic will, because one of the other things he did is a lot of the events in the game that give you positive boosting your strategic will, they're reducing your opponent's strategic will by more than that. And so if you kind of you tit for tat back and forth, you're both actually still dropping over time. One of the examples would be and this is one I think about, you talk about TC is, but the fact that you have good generals and you feel like you can hold on for a while as the Confederates is anytime a battle happens with 20 strength points or more involved total, which is almost always going to be two armies clashing, but it can be 5 versus 15, 10 versus 10, etc. Anytime there's 20 or more, that's considered a large battle, a battle that's going to be read about in all the papers. Mm-hmm. Whoever wins that battle is going to get a 3-point strength, strategic will strength boost, because anytime that happened, right? Like when Lee would get these huge victories, Confederate spirits would ride high and the Union would be demoralized, and the newspapers would run the what if scenarios and who to blame. And so that takes a real toll on the Union. So you can sit here and take your big hammer to the Confederates, and it will sap Confederate manpower, but you have to be really careful, because if you fight a ton of big battles before you get some of your better generals out, you're basically going to be giving the rebels tons of strategic will. Yeah. And they're going to just boost through, their morale is going to go through the roof, and yours is going to start dropping like a stone. So what you end up doing a lot as the Union is you use a lot of your manpower to start doing these naval assaults on river forts, like what the kind of operations that helped get the attention of Lincoln that Grant was doing. But you also start doing a lot of assaults on the fortified ports to make sure that what basically represents the South's, trade, especially to Britain and France. You start landing, taking out these coastal forts, and you just start suffocating. You start suffocating the Confederates. You basically fight where Lee isn't. For a little bit, you really don't want to fight him. You want to kind of do everything you can to build forts and just kind of protect yourself as much as you can, and then punch everywhere else.
That sounds great. I mean, this listening to you talk about, the history of this game, how well it implements it, how it just puts everything together in one package. One of the things I really want to ask you is, in subsequent plays of this game, was there something you learned about the Civil War in particular that you didn't realize until you've played this game? Because I know with like We the People and some other war games I played, there were some events and stuff that happened. I was like, I had no idea, or how it could since this event played this way, it could have swung the other way. And it was a real key insight into the war itself. I was wondering if you had any aha moments while playing For the People.
Yeah, so many, and they still come. So one of the cool things is there's like 3 cards in the deck called Quaker Guns. And in the flavor text at the bottom, I love Mark Herman. It says wooden logs painted to look like cannons. And I was like, what is he doing? So I looked that up. When they started understanding that the Union generals were so reticent to attack and were always wanting to make sure they had the force advantage, they started figuring out that like these generals were easy to psych out. So they would do tricks. They would march the same regiment back and forth in front of the enemy to make it look like there were more men than there actually were. And another thing they do is they would paint these logs and things like that and make it look like cannons to be like, oh my gosh, look at the Confederates. They got all this artillery. Like our intelligence thought we only had like, two battalions of artillery, but they have like 5 or 6. So they would do all this stuff. And so the way that works is if the Union tries to move a general at you, that's a 2 or a 3. So one of the more hesitant generals, you can play this card and just be like, nope, Quaker Guns, boom, you're done. Now, it doesn't work on the guys who are not gun shy like Grant and Sherman. They're ones. So I love that he puts that in there. It doesn't work against everyone, but against the more hesitant commanders. And you have to think about that as a Union. I think I have this army he's going to go, but I don't know if he's going to psych out my general. And you might think that's almost mean, but it's like, well, that happened. So Mark's putting it in the game, and I love it. I think it's great.
Well, that just seems to me like just savvy, like being able to manipulate the psychological aspect of the war, which is really what like the Rebel Yell and everything was about. I did have a question, if you don't mind me interjecting here. Sure. You mentioned that kind of the scope of this game is that you're controlling not just, a single battlefield, not just a single general, but you're kind of like the puppet master, right? Or the commander-in-chief of each unique side. Yep. Is there anything that the game does to sort of get into the head or get it, like the headspace of those unique individuals who each had their own gifts and challenges, like Jefferson Davis and Abraham Lincoln?
Yeah, I think that's one thing Mark Herman talks about in his designs is he wants to make you feel like a certain person. In Empire of the Sun, he wants you to be MacArthur, who was the commander-in-chief of that whole area of the armed forces, or he wants you to be Yamamoto for the Japanese. And here he puts you in, rather than making you like the god figure over your force, he makes you have to deal with things like the politics of your generals. So when you want to promote generals, if you want to promote a guy who isn't as politically connected, then you are going to have to pay a strategic will penalty to reflect the idea that people, it wasn't a meritocracy strictly. Like, sure, at times, like if a general does really badly, like eventually at some point you could force him out. But there were lots of generals that Jefferson Davis could not stand, and yet he couldn't just get rid of them because the political penalty was too high. He still had to deal with electoral politics. And the same thing for Lincoln. There's generals that you're going to hate in this game, like Ben Butler. You just want to, you never want to see his counter, and yet he's going to come out and be there for you. And you have to deal with him and figure out, where can I put you to do the least amount of damage and not hurt me?
You're just,
but that's what you have to deal with. Yeah, you're worthless. You have no combat skills on offense or defense, because every general has an offense and defense rating. But every general has a activation rating, the 1, 2, or 3. The easier or harder they are to move. And then they have a little political rating. And unfortunately, most of the highly politically connected generals, especially on the Union side, are very bad. And so you have to make the decision of how many bad guys do you promote so that you don't have to pay a political penalty in the form of strategic will, and how many are you going to promote who are better, who show more talent, but are going to make you pay a political price. And that's a fascinating aspect about this game. And as the Union, especially early on, you are going to be cursing your generals, as well as when you get these hands and you get like 1s and 2s and all your generals are almost 3s. It's like, I've got these massive hammers just ready to go, but I can't get my generals to move. And Mark Herman talks about reading these telegraphs, and Lincoln was constantly frustrated with his generals. He's like, move, attack, look, you need to take this city. You need to try to take this rail hub. And he couldn't, his generals were always like, I need more time. I need to train my men more, or I need better intelligence. And so I feel like and I know more about Lincoln. I need to read more about Davis to understand some of the things that he dealt with. I know that he clashed a lot with guys like Bragg and didn't like him. He didn't like Joseph Johnston particularly, who was the first commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. Although Johnston was a lot better than the first commanders the Union generals had. But
a lot of the stuff that I've taken in has kind of been critical of Davis himself, just in that a lot of his decisions, they say, were kind of like fueled by kind of almost corrupt like nepotism, and so they say that the general side of the South really outshined the leadership of the Union armies, but that politically had Jefferson Davis maybe been more of a leader and less of a good old boy, I guess. That's at least one thing. I was curious to see, maybe that was reflected, but it could be that this is more focused on the militaristic aspect, which would not necessarily reflect that specific interpretation.
It would be really cool if there was a way to implement that. I don't feel like you'd ever be able to get new players into the game. I feel like that's something you'd have to somehow add, like an
extra
after you already knew the game.
Part. Yeah,
it really would. Yeah, so you do see it in, like I said, and I think I put that in one of the notes in my little notes here. The thing is, like, that's the one thing I would love to even see more of. But it's like, at what point? You can't have everything in a game. You just can't. Like, if you want to throw more into the politics, I almost feel like you have to take something else out because there's so much depth in there. Or, like I said, you'd literally have to add it on after the fact. And I'd love to ask Mark Herman someday if you ever thought about adding even a little bit more into the politics, because he's amazing at putting politics into his games too, with games like Churchill and some of those other ones. And so
fantastic.
He is a very thoughtful designer of putting you into these guys' shoes, making you feel the same pressures they have. And as Jefferson Davis, you're seeing these things come in as the blockade level rises, as these coastal forts start to drop, which is your lifeline to the outside world, to be able to bring in commerce, guns. The South only had 2 arms manufacturing facilities in, I believe it was Charleston and Richmond at the start of the war. And the Union had like 19. It was insane. With the manpower advantage, the banking, most of the banking happened in the Northeast. Almost every single advantage you could want belonged to the Union. And so as the South, you start to get to the point where you almost want to chuckle Hail Mary, because you start to realize, like, okay, I can't last forever. This is a war of attrition. I am the scrappy 150-pound, whatever that is, middleweight fighter, and I'm up against a heavyweight who has now figured out my moves, and now he's got me. I'm a made man. So basically, I have to go one last round and give everything I got, and I know I'm going to get knocked out after that, because he's figured me out now, and I've got this tiny window to go for it. And you kind of see that in the game, because so many times you get so close to the Confederates, as they did, and it's like you almost call the game, because as your cities start to drop, as your ports start to close, it becomes a ratchet effect. And it's the way it did in the war. It's like all of a sudden every state that falls is a domino, and it just gets harder. You have less reinforcements. Your will starts to drop. You start having to play kind of whack-a-mole because all these leaks start springing. You know, as these rivers fall, all of a sudden the Union can start sailing down these rivers and hit you all over the place, and it's like you just feel completely helpless. And so I think it does a great job of putting you in both sides of their, you know, like I say, you're not dealing. He abstracts out some of the politics, the fact that Lincoln, you know, had his famous cabinet of rivals. There's like a cabinet intrigue is a card that the Confederates can play. It's going to knock 3 strategic will, which is pretty significant off the Union for just playing that card. Of course, that means you're not then activating a general with that card or doing something along those lines. But he does bring in some of the politics, some of the political events like the Trent Affair. I didn't know about that. That almost brought the UK in on the war when they boarded a UK ship that had some clandestine Confederate, their Secretary of War and Secretary of State, I think it was. They were on their way to try to negotiate a trade deal as well as diplomatic recognition from the UK. And the US actually, the Union took them off the ship, and it became a big scandal in England. And they were like, you can't do this. You know, these are men, you know, coming on our ship. And Lincoln actually had a crisis on his hand. If that card gets played by the Confederates, they get a huge boost to their strategic will.
Wow.
But again, it's not something that, and I read about that affair. I didn't know about that. And so, you know, that Lincoln possibly narrowly avoided what could, you know, possibly triggered
international,
international scandal.
I love games where you learn new stuff like that.
Yeah.
So, we're discussing, you know, here that you feel that there's a level of detail that's absent in these games. Because one of the things I found really interesting in the Civil War in particular was in battles, like communication was a huge issue, like trying to coordinate everything. And it seems like in this game, correct me if I'm wrong, it kind of doesn't deal with that. It takes a more abstract level. Do you feel like do you think that was a good trade-off for this game? Do you think there could have been more detail?
I hear what you're saying there. Because, you know, while they do have telegraph, this is the first war that the U.S. fights in where they have telegraph, so they can very quickly communicate to the commanders. But you couldn't just set up telegraph lines to like communicate commands, you know, to your wings and flanks and things like that. And so, yeah, one thing is absolutely true, and you see in a lot of the really good Civil War tactical games is you'll have to sometimes like roll a dice to see if your message even gets through. Or sometimes a general wouldn't understand his orders. Braxton Bragg, one of the things that his subordinates routinely complained about and that he got dressed down for multiple times was he would write orders that like didn't make sense or in some cases were completely ambiguous. And so a lot of times his subordinates would get his commands and they're like, I don't even know what I'm supposed to do. So that's not present that's completely abstracted out in just the fact that, you know, the CSA, that the Confederate States tended to have their crap together a lot better at the beginning of the war. And so that's just represented in the fact that they have better dice roll modifiers. The Union starts to get better, and you start to get in some of your better generals. Some of the cream of the crop starts to rise, and eventually the Union starts getting so desperate. I think some of the politics didn't matter anymore because they kept on losing, and newspaper articles kept on reading, like, what do we have to do to start winning? And I think eventually people just kind of started saying, you get desperate enough, you don't even care anymore. So Grant, you know, for a long, you know, people, what held him back was people thought he was a drunk back then. Drinking especially had a huge, very large negative connotation. Like if you were a drunk, that was worse than it would even be now. You know, not like anyone wants to hear that you're a drunk anymore, but like back then, like that was a huge thing. And he did have some issues with alcoholism. But it's like for a long time, like they was thinking that he probably wouldn't even get promoted ever to the highest command because he didn't have a lot of connections. He wasn't from a political family. He was kind of a rough and tumble guy. He graduated in the middle of his class at West Point. But what's funny is Longstreet, who was the best man at his wedding and who was one of the best generals on the South Side, when Grant became the general, he basically seemed to say it was over. He was telling people, you know, this is one thing I know about Grant. He will fight and he will come after you every day and he will not relent until he is done. And he says that in some of his letters. You can read about this. And so it's like Longstreet saw something in his friend and his, you know, this best man, he was best man at his wedding. He saw something in Grant that he knew Grant was going to basically finish the job when he came in. And so it's just a matter of, you kind of, as Lincoln, you kind of feel like if I can just wait a little bit longer, I can start getting some of these guys into positions that I need them to, because I have all the tools. I have the Navy, I have the naval supremacy, I have the manpower. I just need to get the right guys in place to get me my victory, and I'll get there. And as the South, you kind of start to feel all of the opposite. You know, you start to feel like as this war drags on, even if things are going well on paper, you know that it's just the house of cards is ready to fall. You're just one big defeat away from this domino chain start to just collapse all on top of you.
Well, I just wanted to discuss, you know, I know that we've been gushing about the game, and I know that there's been some little criticisms about it concerning type of level of abstraction, which I wanted to address.
Everything has to abstract at some point. There's there is no game.
Oh, I understand. When we're talking about historical nuts, they get real nitpicky about. Here, so, you know, and that's just the nature of wargaming in general. I mean,
and for those people, we have games like World in Flames. You know, we have the 100,000-hour games and stuff, so they can have managing the morale of every single fighter in every single battle.
So, Jonathan. So we've talked about this game. We've really enjoyed it. It's like, oh, this is great. This is good. How would you go about recommending people to play this? Because I know when my first GMT game I ever got was Twilight Struggle. I knew nothing about it. When I ripped open that box and I saw what was in that thing, I about had a heart attack. So how would you, what would you recommend to people who are like listening to this podcast? It's like, oh, I love the Civil War. This sounds really interesting. This sounds great. How would you suggest them going about learning this game? Learning to play it?
The way I would do it, honestly, I'm not sure if it's the best way. I grew up reading a ton of books and like I have a pretty good attention span, and I know a lot of people say like, look, I can't sit and slog through a long rule book. And so I kind of did just to slog through it once, just so I kind of felt like I had an overview in my mind. And then I went through the example of play, which we're talking about before the thing kicked off. Mark Herman does the whole year of the way the war actually went in 1861. He does that and plays it out with like the actual cards, and, you know, does the ops and says, okay, this ops, and here's where this army moves, and here's where it drops troops off, and here's the conflict. Oh, this guy rolled a 4, this guy rolled a 5, here's what happened, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a good way to kind of get through the start. And then what I would do, if you can find somebody who knows how to play the game, that's actually one of the best ways, because they can kind of cut out a lot of the excess fat. Like when you read through the rule books, he has pages and pages of like just how like your army organizational structure works and how the demotion process works and the morale penalties for taking generals who aren't as politically connected, and and all that. Honestly, you really don't need to read those parts of the rules to play the core of the game. I'd almost say like skip that little part and go straight into when he talks about how to activate your armies, activate your core, and get right into the operations part of the game and into the battles. 'Cause that's where the meat of it is. A lot of that other stuff is it's good Chrome and it's all there, and you need to learn it. But it's almost like you can skip over at the beginning. I would go straight into about chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8 of the. That's the meat of the game. That's where the meat of the game is, and play through that example of play, and he'll kind of touch on all these different things that are happening as it's going through there. And then other than that, I would find someone who knows how to play it. Honestly, that's like I said, I found a guy Juka from Finland, and we played online, and he was extremely helpful. Would point out certain things, and then if I made a move that was like just seriously egregiously bad, he'd like, no, here's why you don't do that. And he helped me a lot with the Riverine rules too, because the river rules were a little bit hard. That was one of the harder things to grok. But once you learned it, and once the way he explained it, then it made a lot of sense.
Yeah, that just want to emphasize. Yeah, whenever I pick up a GMT game in general, I always go through that example of play step by step, and it learns, and then plus you get a feel for it, and it's that's one of the few. I wish other games would do what they do with that. I know Fantasy Flight picked up a little bit when they split their rule, how to play, and their rule book, but it really helps. Hey Joe, you have any more questions? Because I'm kind of running dry here.
What I've been doing is what I'm trying to offer here is the Wikipedia backdrop of all of that you guys have been talking about. But I would say the big question I think that's been eating at my mind, just because of my experience, as somebody who got into the board gaming hobby fairly recently, within the last 5 years, my first experience with any sort of card-driven game was Twilight Struggle, as it was the number one game on Board Game Geek when I was early into the hobby. How does For the People relate to Twilight Struggle?
It's really not even remotely the same. It's so different because in Twilight Struggle, you're fighting for these regions, and it's, like you said, everything is abstracted, but it's even more highly abstracted in Twilight Struggle. You don't have armies moving around. Whereas here, it's I almost feel like For the People in some ways is a little bit easier, a little bit in that you can look and see and touch like, okay, I have this big army here and his capital's there. I want to get there. Like, that's what I want to do. And if you know anything about the history of what these guys did, most of the historical strategies are valid. So if you want to say, okay, I'm the Union and I know I want to take DC, or I'm the Confederates, I want to go and take DC. I can see on the map what my path is. I can see what I have to secure to get there. You might not be able to do it. It's very hard, but you can kind of see concretely. You can see your army. You can kind of see what my goals are. Whereas when you look at Twilight Struggle at first, you're like, it's more abstract, right? Because everything's abstracted, but it's more abstract. So I feel like For the People, you look at it and you can immediately see like, okay, I know what my goals are. If you have a person who's helping you with the game and they can tell you, look, here's how you can go about prosecuting victory. And you can go exactly the way the Union tried to do it. You can go exactly the way the Confederates tried to do it, or you could do it a number of ways. But I feel like in many ways it's a completely different game.
Yeah,
it's a completely different game.
The big difference I notice in the core mechanism is that in Twilight Struggle, if you play an opponent's event, you're playing that event is going to happen, right? And so as you mentioned, Jonathan, there's like if you get dealt an opponent's event in your hand, you should kind of breathe deep, it sounds like, in For the People, because like that's not going to hit you, right?
Yep.
Like, and that's why I think that, like you said earlier, you get in your own head, you're like, holy crap, this could hit. Like, I know all these things that Grant could do, and then like in a later turn, you just draw that card, and you're like, well, won't be having to worry about that. And it's almost like you should play with at least a certain amount of taking risks, not just playing defensively and playing to roll with the punches of these events, because they may or may not even happen. So at its core, you've got that, but there's also, like you said, like the way that you actually get generals into play and the way that you're sort of maneuvering the politics. And that reminds me of the way that there's not just the countries battles going on in Twilight Struggle, but you've also got like, your space racing, you've got your DEFCON that you're trying to maneuver. So it sounds like there's some.
Oh, so I didn't want to cut you off. I was saying, that that's kind of almost like a mini game inside of it of how you're dealing with that, which is a fascinating aspect of the game. And like you said too, I think one of the beauties of how the card-driven system works is it creates a brilliant fog of war without you having to do like hidden deployments or screens or things like that. You really have no idea what your enemy's capability is, because there are times I'll get a hand as the Union early on, and it's actually one of the better hands, and I can actually do a lot of stuff. And then it's a question of, do I aggressively start moving with my armies and let my opponent know so that he kind of retracts to a more defensible position? Do I play my worst cards out early so that I kind of lull him into a sense of security? If it's like, oh, he's playing all these he's building forts. Like, clearly he doesn't have a very good hand this turn. I'm going to go on the offensive. And then I pull out my big guns and start hitting him. And the same thing with the Confederates. Sometimes you get a really good hand, and it's like, how do I play this out right? Because you could play it 50 different ways of when you get your hands of how you want to manipulate, what order you want to play these cards in. And there have been times where I've just straight out bluffed and been bluffed by an opponent, been getting ready to march to try to cut off DC from their rail lines of supply. And all of a sudden he comes and marches with one of his really slow to move generals on my flank to cut me off, say, through the Shenandoah Valley. And I'm like, does he really have like another card to move him again? I'm like, he's already played like 2 3s. Like, could he really have another 3 in his hand?
Yeah.
And you sit there and think, and you're like sweating. You're like, I don't know what I ought to do. And then the guy turns over like, oh, he had a 1 at the end. He bluffed me. That's a beautiful thing about. It's not like it's happening completely irrespective of anything else that's going on. But you can play a lot of mind games with your opponent based just upon one thing Mark said he wanted about in this game is you need to make threats, and then if you don't have the cards, like, wait for the cards to come there or act like you have them. So like, even if you don't have the card, just make him think you do. Like, place an army here, and it's like, does he have a card that's going to allow him to do, a large river assault with Grant? Like, well, I don't know. But just by doing that, you can now make the Confederates scramble to try to have to deal with that, even if you don't have the card or not. And so there's a lot of head games going on as you're playing this game because you just don't know what your opponent has. Not just the events, like I said, even just, does my opponent have what Mark calls a high mobility hand, lots of high ops cards, which means he can move most of his generals on almost every single card, or does he have a low mobility hand, in which case he can't do a lot? you don't know, and you don't want to let your opponent know. So don't sit there and look at your hand and be like, oh, I'm not gonna move anyone this turn, because now as a Confederates I can run wild. I know you're not gonna be able to respond to me. So that's one of the fun parts about that game is when you get a good hand and it's like, how can I maximize this? And when you get the really bad hand where you're like,
how do I survive this?
How can I survive this round? Because it is going to suck so bad.
Yeah, it sounds like with this game in particular, this is a large reason why I like Washington's War so much, is that if you can control the initiative, you can control the flow of the game. And if you can like just do little moves like you said, like I'm going to move this here, I can't do anything with them again. I mean, with Washington's War, I mean, it's not about fighting. It's about maneuvering and your opponent to jump and then dictate the flow of the game. And it sounds like this may have a little element of that in it. So
maneuvering is very critical in this game, because the best thing about it is, while it is, you do have to turn spaces in order to gain control of states, which is crucial. That's how you get strategic will for either side, is by taking the other guy's states, at least enough of it to count. Like you can't just take like 1 or 2 spaces. There's a lot more spaces on the map, as you'll see on the point-to-point map, than Washington's War. But Washington's War, you don't really have to deal with supply so much. As long as you can always retreat to a friendly or neutral space, your armies are fine. Well, in this game, supply, you can see why supply lines are so important. And as they historically were, is if you ever get out of supply, it's bad. You start suffering attrition. The enemy side gets dice roll modifiers in their favor. And as the Union especially, one of the best ways to start getting better hits and get better results in combat is to try to find ways to cut off the Confederate Army supply, especially if they're being aggressive. And it shows why it was so critical that Lee had to be careful when he went north, because when he's fighting in his interior lines, he has plenty of ways to bring supplies to his forces when he's in Virginia. But as soon as he starts moving into Maryland or Pennsylvania, especially with all the rocky ground, such as the Alleghenies and some of the other mountain chains out there, but what's the other one? I can't think of it. But in the West Virginia, kind of Pennsylvania area, you've got the Allegheny Mountains, and I can't think of the other one. But you've got very narrow lines of supply that you can draw. So as soon as you go north, you're immediately like, I might get cut off. Like, I lost in my tournament game because I went for the jugular. I went for DC. I left Longstreet with a corps at Manassas Junction, which was where the first major battle was fought, right? That's where the people actually went out and like watched from DC. They were like, oh, let's go out and see. And they had no idea just how brutal this conflict was going to be. They went for the rail junction, which is right near DC, is about 20 miles away. And it's on the north part of Virginia. So I had him holding that critical rail junction for Longstreet, and I went around north and I went for the capital. And my opponent did something I didn't expect. He actually evacuated it and took the massive 30 strategic will hit. He almost lost, but he then went behind me and knocked out Longstreet. And because the Confederates have no navy, as they historically really didn't, they had basically a couple ironclads and some clipper ships and things like that they would use to run the blockades. And so you can't evacuate by the navy. Like the Union can always evacuate by sea. They can do that very easily. As the Confederates, you can't. And so he then cut off my retreat. I was then out of supply, and I couldn't fight my way back to safety, and my army got completely annihilated. Which is exactly, yeah.
Again, that's what's great about these type of games. And when I usually teaching war games and something like, and people are always like, well, the dice roll didn't go my way. It's like, no, it's not about the dice roll modifier. It's not about, it's how you strategically play your army and how to get in to win without having to a big head-to-head fight. I mean, that really sunk in with Washington's War. It sounds like you got this different, same type of thing going on.
Yeah. Anyone who says this game has too much luck in it, don't get me wrong. Like, is there luck? Absolutely.
Yeah.
But as I talked about too, early on, the Confederates, if you want to use your best generals, you will not lose hardly any fights because you will just have such superior dice roll modifiers. But your generals are going to start dropping like flies. And the other thing is, because of how the combat, there's asterisks on the chart. And if you have a tie, each tie goes to the defender. But the asterisk result, if you have that breaks the tie in favor of the attacker. One brilliant thing Mark put in the game is if you're fighting in a capital space or a resource space, the asterisk no longer counts. And because defenders were always in the better position, the most of the time the defender won. That's why a couple of times when Lee actually wasn't defending or making maybe say in a defensive counterattack, He lost both times on the offense going into both Gettysburg, trying to take those fortified positions, as well as at Antietam. Being the defender in your capital spaces is extremely hard to take, and that is well reflected by that they were never able to take Richmond. They were never able to take some of these highly fortified cities. And so the Confederates could basically win every battle up to DC. When you get to DC, the fact that you cannot count on that asterisk to break the tie for you makes it extremely difficult. And without getting too much into the weeds of actually pulling out the combat chart and showing you, it's just a simple combat chart, 1 to 10 result. But that little subtle mechanic of that asterisk no longer counting as a tiebreaker when you're in a capital space means you can basically pound your way all the way to DC, and all of a sudden you've got a hard time taking that city. And people who say there's too much luck in this game, there's a guy named James Pay who's been playing this since I believe 2001, and I kid you not, he has won every single time but one. He has literally won like a 17 Pete with one time he lost to a guy from Finland named Riku something. And this is why you never trust the Finns, because they are way too good at everything. I believe he also broke Twilight Struggle for a little while, and they had to release some changes for that. I'm not even kidding. But this guy had studied the game and found a way to basically kind of break the supply rules to raid all the rail connections off the north. And he actually beat James Pay. James Pay only lost once. So he's won like literally 18 other times. You go to the BPA, the WBC thing, and look at all the people who have lost or won over the years. So you can't tell me, and they get like 60 plus people every year to turn out for this at WBC. So you can't tell me that this game has too much luck in it when literally the same freaking guy wins, 5 or 6 games back to back to back, because they only play one game. It's single elimination. There's a ton of skill in this game. And maybe he's just like a robot or a super genius or something.
I heard that it was that last year's WBC when all this went down. It was that the WBC game where the people was like something to behold. I was just like, wish someone was there at the camera so I could just see this thing go down. It sounded like it was pretty incredible.
Yeah, he's amazing at other games too. So I mean, it's not like it's just even for the people. He's won 5 or 6 times in the last 20 years at Hannibal Rome versus Carthage, one of those other great late 90s CDGs that came out. So, but I'm just kind of trying to point out that like, this is a skill game. Yes, there is luck. I'm not saying there's going to be times where you're just going to get that pear-shaped die roll result, but similar to any game, don't let it come down to a die roll. Just don't do it. Don't make it so close.
That's what Mark says. Is like if you're counting on the dice to win you the game, then you've lost the game. Yep. Because it never goes in your favor.
Yep.
Well, geez, this might be a good time. Any more questions before we wrap this up, Joe?
Nothing in specific. I've really been just poring over these different Wikipedia forums and whatnot. I'm learning a lot about these different battles as we bring them up. So, and
that's the great thing about GMT games. I find in general is that you play them, you read them, you find all these events, and you get obsessed with the setting, and then you pour over it. You want to play the game, and it just like consumes you. Like right now, Colonial Twilight's just in my head 24/7 right now, and I've played it once just that history. But it sounds like this has done the same thing with the Civil War. So, as any parting thoughts, is there any last say you want to say about the game? It's your forum right here. Say what you need to say.
The last couple things I would say. One thing I kind of after we went past about the best way to learn it is go to Axe Warhorse Sim. Sometimes just go on there. You don't even have to make an account, although it's free to do so. And that's what they use. It's secure card drawing and card playing and dice rolling. All it's for tournament play mainly, but it's also even for people who want to do it friendly. It's an easy way to play the game. Then you can pair it up or not with that. You don't even have to use Vassal then at that point. You put everything in on there and it keeps a game log of everything. If you want to learn this game, just go in and look at some of the tournament games that are going right now. You can click on it and you'll see it'll say like BPA. Round, whatever, game, whatever. Just go on there and they'll document everything out. They'll say, okay, this card, and it'll show the text, and they'll say, I'm using this to activate, PGT Beauregard with 5 strength points, and he's going to move here, drop, and they'll put all that out there. And that's actually also another way I learned some of the game and learned some of the strategies. James Pay was playing in the online tournament, which he wins that every year as well. He was playing, and I was just kind of watching. I'm like, okay, all of his moves are here, like for me to see. I can see everything he did, and just kind of learning. And it also helped me learn the rules and seeing, okay, this is what happens when this happened. Like I wasn't sure about this in the rule book, but that exact scenario just came up. Here's how it handled. Okay, now I understand it. So I would say that's one good way is to go onto Axe Warhorse Sim and just take a look at some open game logs, and you can read and see how the game played out and follow along with your hard copy or however you want to do that. The other thing I would simply say is it teaches a lot of a really good history, and it makes you. He didn't talk about the river rules, but like that was one of those things where after I play the game, I start to understand so much why the Union pursued the strategy of bisecting the South the way they did through the river, because when these forts get taken down and get dropped, as the Union, you can basically sail all over the Mississippi and the tributary rivers, and that's simply because the forts are no longer there to stem the tide of your gunboats. You know, the Union basically made these what they call brown water navies, these gunboats that could basically provide massive amounts of amphibious assault firepower. And one of the coolest things that Mark puts in this game that's missing from a lot of games, there's just river crossings, and you can just go and start marching willy-nilly as the Confederates across these rivers. That does not happen in For the People. You have to have a fort or an ironclad at the river crossing just to allow you to cross. And if you ever lose that fort, you're trapped. You're now on the Union side. And that's a reason that the Confederates never tried to march into Illinois, for instance, and cross, say, the Mississippi or the Ohio rivers into doing that. It was extremely hard to do because the Union had a massive advantage in there. And so as the Confederates, you're also always worried. It's like, why were these river forts so important? Mark Herman, by deciding to take that challenge on and making that change from the first edition moving forward, is he said, okay, I want to show why the Confederates had all these issues operating in the Trans-Mississippi Theater and things like that, because it was such a difficult thing for them to do anywhere where the Union had gunboats they could get. You basically couldn't even try to cross the river. And so I think people sometimes might look at these rules and say, like, oh, this is so complex. This is too much Chrome. No, this is exactly what needed to happen in order to make this game play out the way it needs to, and why you can see it. Why Grant did what he did, why he basically hewed right to the river. And I was listening to a historical podcast, like a 10 series podcast about the Civil War, and he talked about the Vicksburg campaign, and even with sticking close to the river at any given time, of the 90,000 men at his disposal, Grant had about a third of all of his troops just guarding supply lines, because the Confederates, especially their cavalry and partisans, were constantly ripping up telegraph wire, stealing horses, stealing cattle, just provisions, things like that. And by staying on the rivers and staying on the river ports where he had supremacy, he could direct most of his troops and ammunition and provisions down that way. And it was just a much easier way for him to avoid all of these long supply lines over land. So I think that's just one of the brilliant things about this game. One of the reasons why I can't play many other Civil War games is the river system. And it sounds weird and quirky, but it works. It's so good. Yeah, it really is.
So even when you lose this game, do you enjoy playing it?
Oh my gosh. It's weird how much I enjoy getting beat. Like I said, I played Jukka from Finland 6 times, and he beat me every time. And each time I was like, when are you ready to go again? I have a better time, and of course, then he beat me down again. And it's like, all right, well, no, okay, that's the weakness of this strategy, and I'm going to come after again. It's a lot like Hands in the Sea. Those are probably my top 2 games of all time right now. And they're about neck and neck in terms of, like, every time I play it, even when I lose, I'm like, okay, I want to play again. I want to do it again. And I want to see what I can do differently this time.
That's great, because I think that's one of the things I like doing the long view is, like, I always like talking to people. That's a question I usually like to ask, is even there's just the passion of losing. It's just like, I like this game so much that even when I lose, I still love the game, which I think is real. It's great. I mean, that's a sign of a game that you really enjoy.
And it's kind of a little bit like, the last thing I was gonna say is kind of like sports too, is like when you really love a sport, and like when a loss sticks with you or a memorable win, it sticks with you for a long time. And this is why I said too, like, don't get me wrong, I still love Euros. I have a lot of Euros on my shelves, and especially the deeper Euros, and I'm getting into 18xx now, and I can see now why people, it's almost like the war game of non-war games, because there's so much theme and story coming through and memorable moments. But it's like, there are moments I'm never going to forget about For the People, just like Hands in the Sea. Maneuvers I pulled off, or maneuvers that were pulled off on me, and I will never forget them. And it's just hard to do that when it's like Puerto Rico, a game that I love, but it's like, I don't remember when I like built a university that's like, let's have an extra colonist. So I don't know. Like, I don't want to trash these things. I like them, but there's so many memorable things that happen in these games, and it's just so hard to compare to others. It is why most Euro type games, I don't think about them after the game is over. Like, I had a lot of fun while I was in there and maximizing my engine or trying to block other people, do whatever, but I don't usually think about them days and days after. Not the case with For the People. There's games I still think about that were a year gone. Still think about them and think about things I could have done differently, and what if I had done this. And yeah, I think that's
yeah, those are the type of games that get to you. Trust me.
I think
just stew over them.
And it sounds like Jeff Gamble would be right behind you, with, when he was making his top 10 games, like, it was punctuated by, like, sort of memories and stories that he could tell about the games, and those things that you can take away. It's going to be like dramatic turns, and storytelling is going to play a larger role, like from a simulationist aspect. And that's, those are the types of things that can really create the types of, stories where you still remember them 5-10 games into the future.
Yep.
Yeah.
I agree.
Well, dang, this has been a good episode. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for coming back.
Thank you guys for having me.
When Joe said you're coming back, I was actually pretty pumped about it. I went out and said, Joe, I want to host this one. I want to host this one.
Yeah, Jonathan, your Hands in the Sea episode was like a gift to TC.
I'll do what I can, man.
And I'm really looking forward to maybe doing a future episode over Fort Sumner after we get our hands around that one and start playing it, because that's another Civil War game, but that's supposed to be like a 45-minute Mark Herman card-driven game. So maybe there's
it seems weird. Weird to say 45 minutes and Mark Herman in the same sentence, because the guy is.
Well, I mean, that's I imagine for us it'll be like a 2-hour game, but still, that's the goal.
I'm looking forward to hear about it, and I just I say again, thanks guys for letting me come on and talk about this game. It's
an absolute pleasure to have you on, and any time in the future you want to talk about any war game, I will take the reins again, and we will for another 2 hours, because I love this kind of stuff. I really think some of these games don't get enough exposure that they need to have, even though they're older ones. Heck, nowadays in this cycle, if it's like 2 months old, it's yesterday's news. So it's important to like these are good older games that have merit, that need to be played. And the more people talk about it, we can get other people enthused. So hey, we're doing some good here. Yeah, For the People, extremely well supported. Been out 20 years. Been playing competitively for 20 years at WBC, almost 20 years at WBC, and I don't know what the age, obviously it's been through many printings. It's one score old. It's one it's one score old. Thank you. There we go. You got it in, Joe. Yay! I did, I was waiting for that. For your mom, I was going to sneak in by the end of the episode, but I came up with that one on my own. Okay. Well, thank you. That's pretty good, actually. Yeah. Well, thanks again, guys, and just have a good night, and again, appreciate the opportunity to come on and ramble. Looking forward to the next time we'll have you on, dude. Yeah. Memories here. Thanks, guys. Okay. And there, now that's the end of it. I can start editing it. So thanks, Jonathan. Oh, when Joe said you're back on, I'm like, yes, I want to do this. Yes, I seem like this whole page email. Yes, please, yes, please, yes. Have you played For the People? No, but I played other Mark Herman games. I want to talk about it. Well, thank you. That's high praise. I appreciate it.